Welcome to the story of love, betrayal, and the unraveling of a seemingly perfect life. Follow Andrew's journey as he faces a world turned upside down after a seemingly small moment shifts everything he thought he knew about his marriage with Emily. This is a story of trust, loss, and the painful path to self-discovery. Let's begin the story today. The soft glow of early morning sunlight crept through the curtains, casting a warm golden light across the room. Emily stirred in bed, her rounded belly rising and falling with each deep breath. The quiet hum of life outside seemed to be a perfect reflection of the peace in their home. At 5 months pregnant with twins, she had begun to feel the subtle, gentle movements of her babies inside her. Each little kick, each soft flutter was a reminder of the love and new life growing within her. She smiled softly, her hand instinctively resting on her belly, a protective gesture that spoke of the deep, unconditional love she had already begun to feel for her children. In the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the soft sound of Ethan humming a tune as he cooked. The rhythmic clattering of pans seemed to be the perfect accompaniment to the peaceful morning, a reflection of their comfortable, loving routine. It was a morning like any other, a morning where everything seemed right in the world. Ethan, with his tousled hair and kind eyes, turned from the stove and grinned at Emily as she walked into the kitchen. His smile was effortless, one that had been a part of his daily existence for as long as she could remember. He loved her, that was certain, but it was more than that. He believed in her, in them, in the life they were building together. "Good morning, my love," he greeted, his voice light, filled with warmth. Emily stretched lazily and laughed, the sound as melodic as the breeze outside their window. "Good morning," she replied, her voice tender and soft. "Not much. They were practicing all night. I swear they've got more energy than I do." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "They're gonna be a handful, I can already tell." He reached for her, pulling her into a tight hug. "But I'm excited. We're going to make it through, Emily. Together. I believe in you. I believe in us." Emily leaned into him, her heart swelling with a quiet happiness. "You always know how to make things happen," she said softly, her voice full of admiration. The way Ethan spoke, the way he always knew how to reassure her, how to make her feel safe, was something she cherished every single day. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of breakfast, the sound of the sizzle, and the warmth of their love. There was nothing remarkable about the morning in the grand scheme of the world, but for Emily and Ethan it was everything. A quiet promise that their lives would continue to be just this way, gentle, loving, peaceful, forever. As Ethan prepared to leave for work, Emily kissed him softly on the cheek, a gesture so natural, so simple, but so full of meaning. "I love you," she whispered, the words wrapped in warmth and sincerity. "I love you too," Ethan responded, his voice steady, filled with the certainty of his feelings. "I'll be back soon, and when I get home, we'll talk about expanding the business. We'll plan for the future, for them," he said, his hand resting on her belly. "For our family." The words hung in the air, heavy with hope and anticipation. Their future was bright, filled with dreams of their growing family, of the life they were creating. Was about to enter their lives. The day passed like any other, until the peaceful rhythm of Emily and Ethan's life was shattered. It started with a headache, nothing alarming, just a dull ache at the back of Emily's head. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was the result of a long day, but as the afternoon wore on, the pain intensified. A cold sweat began to bead on her forehead, her pulse quickening as the room around her seemed to grow smaller. She reached for her phone to call Ethan, but her hands trembled so much that the device slipped from her grasp. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last, until the world around her began to spin. She tried to stand, to call for help, but her legs gave way beneath her and she collapsed onto the floor. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a siren, but it seemed so far away, as if the world had suddenly become too vast, too cold. Her vision blurred, the edges of her world turning black. Ethan sat in his office, absorbed in his work, unaware of the chaos that was unfolding at home. His phone buzzed on his desk, the notification a harsh reminder of the life he had left behind to chase his dreams. He glanced at the screen, but when he saw the name Emily flash across the screen, his heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, he answered the call. "Emily?" he asked, his voice instantly filled with concern when no response came. "Nothing but static." "Emily?" he repeated, his voice rising in urgency. A knot twisted in his stomach. When the call ended abruptly, Ethan's fingers trembled as he dialed again. But there was no answer. The line went dead. At that moment, a dreadful feeling settled in his chest. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor as panic surged through him. Without a second thought, he bolted out of his office, leaving his colleagues in stunned silence. He rushed to his car, each passing second feeling like an eternity, the world outside becoming a blur of color and sound as his mind raced. Don't forget to like if you find this story meaningful to you and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. As Ethan pulled into the driveway, his heart pounded in his chest. The front door was ajar. That was all it took for his stomach to drop, for fear to sweep through him like a wave crashing against the shore. He didn't hesitate. He ran inside, his breath ragged, his thoughts spinning. "Emily," he whispered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. Inside, everything was eerily quiet. The stillness of the home felt wrong. His footsteps echoed as he made his way toward the nursery, a cold, sinking sensation crawling up his spine. When he reached the doorway, his heart stopped. There she was, his Emily, lying motionless on the floor, her face pale, her chest still. Time seemed to freeze, the world around him dimming as he dropped to his knees beside her. Desperately, he placed his hands on her chest, pressing down with all his might, willing her to breathe, to live. "Emily, please," he cried, his voice raw with fear. "Don't leave me, not like this, not now." But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many times he pressed his hands to her chest, there was no response. Her body remained still, cold. The air felt thick, suffocating. The paramedics arrived minutes later, but the news they brought was crushing. "I'm sorry, sir," the lead paramedic said gently, his face a mask of compassion. "She's been gone for several hours now." "No, you're wrong," Ethan insisted, his voice breaking. "She's just sleeping. She's just tired." But the paramedic's eyes were kind, filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry, sir. We did everything we could." As Ethan stood by Emily's side, watching the paramedics prepare her for transport, he clung to the hope that somehow, impossibly, she would wake up. His mind refused to accept the truth. He couldn't fathom a life without her, not now, not ever. Unseen but present in the deepest recesses of his heart, a single thought echoed in his mind over and over. "I love you, Emily. I'll always love you." In that moment, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the world seemed to hold its breath. And for Ethan, the next few hours, the next few days, would be shaped by the deafening silence of loss and the faintest, most unlikely spark of hope. Ethan's world was crumbling, each passing second unraveling the fragile threads of reality he had once held so tightly. His mind, once sharp and decisive, was now a chaotic storm of confusion, fear, and disbelief. As he stood at the threshold of his home, staring at the open door, he felt as though the universe itself had shifted beneath his feet. It was as though the ground he stood on had turned to quicksand, pulling him deeper with every breath. How could this be real? How could she be gone? His pulse pounded in his ears as he stepped over the threshold, the air thick with a suffocating stillness that made every movement feel sluggish, heavy. Each footstep echoed through the house like a hollow drumbeat, the sound deafening in its emptiness. The air was thick with the remnants of their life together, the scent of coffee still lingering, the half-eaten breakfast left on the kitchen counter, untouched. With trembling hands, Ethan reached for the door to the nursery. The knob felt cold in his grip, as if it were made of ice, unwilling to open. His heart was in his throat, a choking lump that made it hard to breathe. "Please," he begged silently, "please, let this be a dream." But as the door creaked open and he stepped inside, there was no denying it. The room was still, so painfully still. It was as if time had frozen, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for him to accept the truth that hung in the air like a shadow. Emily lay motionless on the floor, her pale skin a stark contrast against the soft pinks and blues of the nursery. The world seemed to slow as Ethan's mind tried to process what his eyes were seeing. This was not the woman he had kissed goodbye just hours ago. This was not the vibrant, glowing mother-to-be who had laughed about the twins' mischievous kicks. This was something else, something foreign, something he couldn't bring himself to comprehend. He dropped to his knees beside her, his body jerking with the force of his despair. His hands shook violently as he tried to feel for her pulse, to find some sign, some flicker of life. The skin beneath his fingertips was cold, unnervingly cold, like the touch of a marble statue. No, 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 this can't be happening. "Emily, please," his voice cracked, the words strangled by the weight of his grief. He repeated her name over and over, as though calling it out could somehow make her wake up. "Please, please come back. I need you. We need you." But there was no response, only the echo of his own desperate pleas. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat louder than the last. It felt as if his very soul was being ripped apart, piece by piece. The very core of his being, his love for her, his hope for their future, the dream of raising their children together, was crumbling, dissolving into nothingness. Every inch of him screamed for this not to be true, but the reality of it sank into his bones like a winter chill. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tightening as the panic swelled inside him. His mind was a battleground, a war between disbelief and the undeniable truth. "I can't lose her. I can't. Not now. Not like this." His hands were still trembling, but he found his voice again. "Emily, come on, please. You can't leave me like this. You can't leave us." His words were almost a plea, a cry for a miracle that he knew deep down was impossible. But miracles have happened before, haven't they? A part of him clung to that fragile hope, clung to the belief that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe I'll wake up and she'll be here with me, laughing like she always does. But no matter how long he pressed his ear to her chest, no matter how many times he shouted her name, there was no change. She was still, silent, lifeless. She fell forward onto her bottom, her body jerking backward amid the soft fabric of the pillows. And yet, he refused to accept it. This can't be real. This can't be my life. This can't be happening. But even as he denied the truth, even as he fought against the cruel reality that consumed him, Ethan knew in his heart that nothing would bring her back. The agony of that realization was suffocating. The world around him was closing in, each breath harder than the last, until it felt as though the walls themselves were pressing in on him. The shrill sound of sirens filled the air, but it was too late. The paramedics arrived, their faces etched with the grim determination of their work. They worked quickly, with practiced efficiency, but their expressions said it all. They knew. They knew that there was nothing more they could do. "I'm sorry, sir," the lead paramedic said gently, his voice filled with sympathy. "She's been gone for several hours now." The words were like a slap to the face, each one hitting harder than the last. "No," Ethan denied, his voice rising in defiance. "You're wrong. She's just sleeping. She's going to wake up." He grabbed the paramedic's arm desperately, his fingers cold and stiff. "Please, please, just help her. Just give her a chance." But the paramedic shook his head, his gaze soft with pity. "I'm so sorry, sir. We did everything we could." "Everything you could?" The words ricocheted in his mind, but they felt like hollow echoes, unable to reach the corners of his broken heart. He stumbled back, his legs unable to support him as the weight of his grief crushed him from all sides. How could this happen? How could she just be gone? As the paramedics moved Emily's body, the room seemed to tilt. The walls seemed to tilt, the walls spinning with the force of Ethan's grief. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as though the very ground he stood on was shifting, threatening to give way. His heart ached with a pain so deep it felt like it would never end. It was a raw, unrelenting ache that consumed him entirely. There was no time for this, there was no way to prepare for it, no warning, no preparation, no goodbye. Just gone, just like that. And all Ethan could do was stand there, helpless, crushed under the weight of the impossible truth. The house, his home, felt colder now, as if the warmth had been sucked out of it, leaving behind only the hollow ache of absence. There was no love left here anymore, no warmth, just the cold, crushing reality of his loss. The world outside continued on, oblivious to the devastation that had just unfolded inside the walls of Ethan's life. But for him, time had stopped, and all that remained was the deafening silence, the absence of Emily, and the unrelenting ache that nothing could heal. The house felt empty in a way that Ethan couldn't quite grasp, as though it had become a shell of what it once was. Each room was a silent reminder of what he had lost. The walls seemed to breathe with the absence of Emily's laughter, her gentle hums as she moved around the house, the soft sound of her voice calling his name. Now, it was all still, eerily still. It was as if the house itself had stopped living the moment Emily had slipped away. Ethan stood frozen at the nursery door, his mind a muddled mess of disbelief and helplessness. The paramedics had left, their steps echoing down the hallway, each footfall a painful reminder that he was alone. The room, once filled with the promise of life, of joy, now held nothing but the cold shadows of grief. He could almost hear the soft whispers of what could have been, the sound of tiny feet running across the floor, the murmur of his children's first words, the gentle rustling of baby blankets. All of it, now nothing more than a cruel illusion, a future that would never come. His legs trembled as he moved toward the crib, the small, empty space where 2 lives should have been. He couldn't stop himself from reaching out, his fingers brushing the cold wood as if he could somehow feel Emily's presence again, as if she might walk in at any moment, smiling, telling him everything would be okay. But the silence swallowed his thoughts, leaving nothing but the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest. "How am I supposed to live without you?" he whispered into the stillness, the words barely audible, but they hung in the air like a heavy fog. His voice cracked, breaking against the weight of the unbearable truth. He could feel the tear in his soul, the gaping wound that nothing could heal. Every breath he took felt like a struggle, as if the very act of living was now a betrayal to her. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, its sound growing louder in the quiet. Tick, tick, tick. Each second stretched into infinity, an endless reminder of time slipping away, of moments he would never share with Emily. The ticking seemed to mock him, the constant beat of the world outside going on as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Everything. In the stillness of the house, Ethan's thoughts spiraled out of control. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this alone, this untethered. It was as if the earth had spun off its axis, leaving him drifting in a cold, empty void. His mind, once sharp, now struggled to hold onto anything that made sense. The pieces of his life had shattered, and he didn't know how to put them back together. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, and for a moment, he almost believed he could hear Emily laughing with him. "You're gone," he said to the empty room. "You're really gone." His voice trembled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. As the day wore on, Ethan's thoughts became increasingly erratic. He tried calling the doctors again, hoping, praying, that somehow, some way there had been a mistake, that there was something, anything that could bring her back. But the phone calls only confirmed what he already knew. There was no miracle, no second chance. The hours blurred into one another, each one stretching out in front of him like an endless road, and Ethan wandered the house in a daze. His feet moved automatically, his body moving through the motions without really feeling them. He had no destination, no purpose. He was simply existing, the weight of his grief pulling him deeper with every step. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. He wanted to scream, to break free from the crushing silence, but even the thought of making noise felt like a betrayal. If he spoke, it would somehow make it real, and he wasn't ready for that, not yet. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound jarring him from his trance. It was a message from his best friend Will, asking if he was okay. Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, the words swimming before his eyes. Am I okay? He could almost feel the bitter sting of the question. No, he was not okay. Not even close. He didn't know how much time had passed before he found himself at the window, staring out into the quiet street. The sky was beginning to turn orange as the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the world. But the beauty of the sunset only deepened the emptiness inside him. The world, the universe, everything around him seemed to move on, indifferent to his pain. The world was still alive. But Emily was not. Why her? Ethan wondered, his hand pressing against the cool glass. Why now? He closed his eyes, trying to quiet the storm of questions in his head, but they continued to rage, louder and louder with each passing moment. It was in that moment that the first crack of hope began to appear, a fragile, delicate thread of possibility that barely seemed worth acknowledging. Ethan shook his head, unwilling to entertain the thought, no, I can't think like that. She's gone. She's gone. But even as he told himself that, a part of him couldn't stop clinging to the idea. What if she wasn't gone? What if there was still a chance? His heart began to race, the pulse of hope growing stronger as the possibility planted itself deep in his chest. What if they were wrong? What if there was still a way to bring her back? What if she's not gone? The thought was so absurd, so impossible that it almost made him laugh. But it was there. The idea, the faint glimmer of a hope he couldn't fully shut down. The idea of losing her forever was unbearable. He couldn't accept it, not when he still felt her presence, still heard her voice in the back of his mind, still saw her smile in his memories. She's here, he thought desperately. She has to be. She can't be gone, not like this. It was a fragile hope, one that barely even had room to breathe. But for the first time since the moment he had found her, lifeless on the nursery floor, he felt something other than the suffocating weight of despair. He felt something stirring inside him, a desperate kind of hope. And it was this hope, this tiny flicker of belief, that refused to die, that would drive him to do the impossible. Ethan moved swiftly, his mind made up. He would not accept this, not yet. He would do whatever it took to prove that Emily and their children were still with him, still part of his world. The journey ahead would be filled with uncertainty, with disbelief. But one thing was clear. He couldn't and wouldn't give up. Not now, not when there was still a chance. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Ethan's heart raced with a newfound determination. The world, once so cruel, now seemed to offer him one last thread of hope, and he would cling to it with everything he had. The room felt heavy. Every breath Ethan took was like inhaling a cloud of uncertainty, thick with doubt, yet sharp with the sting of possibility. He stood in the back of the funeral home, his hands shaking as he tried to keep himself composed. His eyes, though bloodshot from the endless tears, were fixed on Emily's coffin, the cold, stark reality of the moment closing in around him. The world outside seemed to fade away, swallowed by the dull hum of grief that had settled over him. He had begged, he had hoped, he had prayed, and yet, in this room, he was facing the most unbearable truth. Emily was gone. His heart knew it, his mind knew it, yet his body fought against it. His heart, his very soul, refused to surrender. How could I let go of her? The question tormented him, gnawing at the edges of his mind, even as the funeral proceeded in quiet formality, the soft murmurs of condolences barely reaching his ears. But there, in that moment, as the priest spoke of eternal rest and heavenly peace, Ethan's thoughts began to blur, the words slipping away like water through his fingers. Everything felt distant, out of reach. His chest was heavy with loss, and the coldness of the room only made the ache more unbearable. It was as though time had slowed, each second stretching on endlessly, cruelly, and all that remained was the hollow echo of goodbye. The lid of the coffin was about to be closed, the finality of it wrapping itself around Ethan like a suffocating shroud. He could barely breathe as he stood there, staring at the lifeless body of the woman he had loved. The thought of never hearing her voice again, never feeling the warmth of her touch, was more than he could bear. It's too soon. She can't be gone. She can't. And then, just as the priest's hands hovered above the coffin's lid, a whisper, barely a tremor, flickered in the air. Ethan froze. Did I imagine that? The sensation was so fleeting that he almost thought it was his own heartbeat, hammering loudly in his chest, but then it happened again. A slight shift, a subtle movement. His heart lurched painfully. "Stop!" he demanded, his voice sharp, breaking the silence of the room. "Stop! Please!" All eyes turned toward him, confusion mingling with concern. But Ethan couldn't tear his gaze away from Emily's body. His pulse raced, the rhythm of his blood echoing in his ears, pounding louder and louder. His thoughts were a whirl of disbelief, but his body knew what his mind couldn't yet comprehend. "Is it?" He stumbled toward her, hands outstretched, his breath shallow and rapid. "Emily," he whispered hoarsely, as if calling her name could somehow bring her back to him. "Emily. Lee. No way. Let me... Great." And then it happened. A movement so slight, so impossible, that it took a moment for his brain to process it. Her chest, her still, lifeless chest, rose. She's breathing. It was the faintest breath, a soft intake of air that seemed to defy everything. The world around him fell away. The faces of mourners blurred into the background, their gasps drowned out by the deafening roar in his own ears. The noise, the suffocating silence, the grief, all of it melted into nothing as Ethan's eyes locked onto the woman he had feared he would never see again. She was there. She was alive. "Emily," he cried out, his voice trembling, full of raw disbelief. "You're alive! You're alive!" Tears blurred his vision as he fell to his knees beside her, not caring about the gasps that erupted from the people around him. He grasped her hand, so soft, so warm. Her skin, once cold, now pulsed with life. Her fingers moved slowly, and her eyes, those beautiful eyes he thought he'd never see again, fluttered open. The color began to return to her face, the pallor of death fading, replaced by the softness of life. "Ethan," she whispered. Her voice weak, barely audible, but it was enough to tear through the veil of despair that had clouded his heart. "Ethan." Her name was a prayer, a miracle, and the very sound of it sent waves of joy crashing over him, drowning out the pain, the fear, the sorrow. She was here. She was alive. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribcage, each beat louder than the last. He held her hand tighter, unable to believe what he was witnessing. Was this a dream? A hallucination? He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, afraid to let the image slip away, afraid that he might wake up and find that it had all been a cruel trick. But no, this was real. She was real. "Emily, thank God," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You're back. You're really back." Emily's eyes met his, a soft, sleepy smile forming on her lips. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt like he could breathe. The weight of the last hours, the crushing burden of grief, began to lift, replaced by an overwhelming rush of love and relief. His mind spun with joy, confusion, and disbelief, but it all came crashing down into one singular, undeniable truth. She was here. She was alive. As he held her close, unable to let go, the room around them seemed to fade into the background, the world now revolving around the two of them, suspended in this moment of impossible hope. The paramedics rushed to her side, but Ethan could barely hear them as he cradled Emily in his arms. He wasn't listening to anyone but her, the sound of her voice, the feel of her breath against his skin. He was lost in the miracle of this moment, unsure how to comprehend it, but knowing with every fiber of his being that he had witnessed something beyond understanding. "She's alive," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "She's really alive?" They remained as the paramedics worked quickly, checking Emily's vitals, making sure she was stable. Ethan remained by her side, never once moving, never once letting go. The warmth of her hand in his was all he needed to know that this wasn't a dream, that this wasn't some fleeting moment of fantasy. She was back. They were going to be okay. "Thank you," he whispered, looking up at the ceiling as though praying to whatever force had brought her back to him. "Thank you." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan truly believed that hope could be real, that miracles could happen. And in this moment, against all odds, the impossible had become possible. Emily was back, and so was everything he had lost. The air felt different now. It was as if the very atmosphere had changed, becoming lighter, less oppressive, as though the universe itself had decided to give Ethan a second chance. The dark, heavy clouds of grief that had hovered over him for what seemed like an eternity were lifting, revealing the first sliver of hope. The room around him, once filled with silence and sorrow, now seemed alive with the sound of hurried voices, the rustle of medical equipment, and the fluttering breath of Emily, still weak but breathing. Alive! Ethan had never known that a heartbeat could sound so sweet. The rhythmic thrum of Emily's pulse beneath his fingertips, the steady rise and fall of her chest, was more than he could have ever asked for. It was a miracle. His miracle. The impossible had happened, and for the first time in days he felt his breath catch not from fear, but from the overwhelming joy of knowing that Emily was still with him. The paramedics worked quickly, but Ethan barely noticed them, his eyes never leaving Emily. Her pale face had flushed with the color of life, her lips beginning to form words, though they were still soft and faint. He was captivated by her every movement, every subtle shift, as though he feared that if he blinked, this miraculous moment might slip away from him. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice a soft prayer, his heart still pounding in his chest. It felt as though it might burst from the sheer weight of his emotions. He was overwhelmed, unsure whether to laugh or cry, unsure if he was dreaming or living in a reality he could scarcely believe. As the paramedics carefully assessed her, Emily's eyes fluttered open, this time more clearly. She looked up at Ethan, her gaze a mix of confusion, exhaustion, and wonder. For a moment, there was a stillness between them, a moment where the world outside seemed to vanish. All that existed was Ethan and Emily, bound together in this extraordinary moment of life and death, of despair and hope. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice so fragile, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. Ethan's heart swelled, and tears sprang to his eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. These were tears of relief, of an overwhelming joy he couldn't put into words. He had feared losing her forever, feared never feeling her touch again. And now, here she was, the woman he loved, back in his arms. "Emily, I thought I lost you," he whispered, his voice cracking, the flood of emotions breaking through his carefully guarded composure. "I couldn't live without you." Her lips parted, a faint, gentle smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, the kind of smile that had always lit up his world. "I'm here," she whispered, the words a balm to the wounds that had torn through him. "I'm right here, Ethan." The room seemed to pause in that moment, the air thick with emotion, with a pure, unadulterated joy of knowing that the woman he loved, the woman who had been torn away from him so suddenly, was back. Ethan could hardly breathe, as though every breath he took now was a gift. He looked down at Emily, his fingers gently brushing her hair, a gesture so tender, so full of love, that it felt like the only thing he could do to prove how grateful he was. "You don't know how much I've missed you," he murmured, as if trying to convey in words what was impossible to say. "I thought I had lost everything, but now I have you. I have you and our children." He glanced toward the nursery, where their twins still awaited, waiting to be welcomed into the world. The thought of their future, of holding their babies in his arms, felt almost too perfect to be true. Emily's gaze softened, her tired eyes sparkling with the faintest glimmer of her old warmth, the spirit that had always carried her. "We're still here, Ethan," she said, her voice gaining strength, though still weak from the ordeal. "We're still here, and we'll be okay." He nodded, his face wet with tears, but this time they were tears of joy, tears of gratitude. He had been given back what he thought was lost forever. The life he had feared was slipping away, the life he had mourned so desperately of what he was to himself. The future he had once dreamed of family, of love, of shared laughter, was still within his reach. As the paramedics prepared to take Emily to the hospital for further observation, Ethan refused to leave her side. He walked beside her, holding her hand tightly, unwilling to let go even for a moment. The world outside felt so distant now. The flashing lights, the sounds of passing cars, the voices of the paramedics, all of it seemed irrelevant, as though they existed in a different dimension altogether. All that mattered was Emily. All that mattered was that she was alive, that she had come back to him. Nothing else seemed to matter anymore. The future, with all its uncertainties, now seemed like an open road. Ethan could see it clearly before him, a path filled with challenges, yes, but also filled with hope. With Emily by his side, with their children on the way, the future was not something to fear, but something to embrace. At the hospital, as the doctors ran their tests and ensured that Emily was stable, Ethan sat by her side, his hand never leaving hers. He didn't want to miss a single moment of this miraculous return. It was as if time had slowed down, as if the world itself had held its breath, allowing Ethan to savor the precious seconds that had been so cruelly stolen from him just hours earlier. "I can't believe this," Ethan whispered as he gently stroked her hand. "I thought I lost you, but now I have you back, and that's everything. That's all I need." Emily turned her head slightly, her smile as soft as a whisper. "You're not alone anymore, Ethan," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that gave him all the reassurance he needed. "We're together, and we'll face everything together." The relief that washed over Ethan in that moment was a flood that left no room for anything else. The terror, the anxiety, the grief, they were all gone, dissolved in the warmth of Emily's presence. The world, once shrouded in darkness, was now filled with the brilliant light of love and hope. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ethan allowed himself to believe that everything would be okay, that life, in all its mystery and uncertainty, would carry them forward, together. And as he watched Emily rest, her breath steady and peaceful, he knew that he would cherish this second chance with every ounce of his being, because in that moment, he had everything, and he would never take it for granted again. As the days passed, the world seemed to shift for Ethan and Emily, gently unfolding into something new, something born from the miracle that had re-entered their lives. The hospital, with its sterile walls and the cold hum of machinery, had become a temporary refuge, a place where they both clung to hope and healing. But now, as Emily was cleared to go home, the world outside the sterile confines of the hospital seemed different, brighter, lighter, and for the first time in weeks, and felt like they could finally breathe again. Ethan stood by Emily's side, his hand never leaving hers as they left the hospital. The sunlight, warm and golden, streamed through the windows of the car, casting a soft glow on their faces. The day felt like a promise that everything would be okay, that they had both survived the worst and were now on the other side of it. The weight of uncertainty and fear had been lifted, and in its place was a profound sense of gratitude. Ethan's heart still raced from the incredible relief, the joy of having her back in his life, but the feeling was different now. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper, something permanent. It was love. It was a love so fierce, so raw that it consumed every part of him. A love that had been tested by fire and had come out stronger, unbroken. And he whispered softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I'll ever be able to express how grateful I am, how thankful I am that you're here, that we're together." Emily, her face still a little pale but glowing with life, smiled up at him, her eyes soft with the depth of what they had both endured. "I don't think words could ever capture it either," she said quietly. She spoke quietly, her voice still tinged with the weariness of recovery, was laced with a strength that made Ethan's heart swell. "But we don't need words, Ethan. We have each other." As they drove home, the house they had once called their sanctuary now felt different. It felt like a place of rebirth, a place where they would rebuild not just their lives, but their spirits. Their hearts, broken only days before, were now filled with a quiet strength that could only come from surviving the unthinkable. They entered the house and the familiar warmth of it enveloped them like a blanket, but it wasn't the same. It was new. It was no longer a home overshadowed by grief, but one bathed in hope, in love, in second chances. It was a place where the future no longer seemed uncertain. It was a place where, despite the scars they would carry, they could rebuild and move forward. And that was the greatest gift of all. The gift of life, the gift of second chances. Ethan looked around, seeing everything with new eyes. The kitchen counter where they had prepared meals together. The nursery, which still stood untouched, a symbol of the future that they had once feared would never come. The living room where they had laughed and loved without a care in the world. All of it now had a deeper meaning. It was a reminder of what they had almost lost. It was a reminder of the power of love, the strength of family, and the miraculous force that had brought them back together. "I can't believe how much we've been given," Ethan said, his voice full of awe as he held Emily close. "How much we've been blessed." Emily rested her head on his shoulder, her breath slow and steady as though savoring the moment, savoring the peace that had finally settled over them. "I never thought I'd be here again," she murmured. "But now that I am, I see everything differently. I see everything through the eyes of someone who has been given another chance, and I'm not taking it for granted, Ethan, not ever again." The days that followed were filled with a quiet joy. There was no grand fanfare, no dramatic celebrations, just the simple, profound act of living. Ethan and Emily spent their time together, savoring the small moments that had once been so easy to overlook. The quiet mornings, the evenings filled with the soft sounds of their conversations, the gentle laughter that now filled their home again. It was a return to something sacred, something that could only be fully appreciated after the storm had passed. And they both knew it. They both knew how fragile life could be, and how precious each moment was. Ethan took to heart the lessons he had learned during the darkest hours of his life. He no longer took anything for granted. Every day with Emily felt like a gift, one he had to treasure. He found himself looking at her differently now, seeing not just the woman he loved, but the warrior she had become. The strength she had shown, the courage she had embodied in the face of death, had left him in awe. "You are everything to me," he said one night, as they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You have always been everything to me, but now I see it with new eyes. I see you, I see us, in a way I never could before." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We've been given a second chance, Ethan. Not just with our lives, but with our hearts. We are stronger now, together." And they were. They had faced the impossible and come out the other side, hand in hand, unbroken. The miracle they had lived through had not just been one of life. It had been one of transformation. It had changed them, shaped them, and given them a depth of understanding about love, family, and faith that they had never known before. In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the warmth of each other, Ethan realized that the resurrection he had prayed for was not just about Emily's return. It was about the rebirth of their love, of their bond, and of their trust in the miracles of life. The twins, still growing inside Emily, were now a symbol of that miracle, a living testament to the power of life, of hope, and of love that refused to die, even in the face of death. Ethan and Emily sat together, hands intertwined, the weight of the world no longer pressing on them. It had been replaced by something far greater, a sense of peace, of purpose, of faith. And as the days passed, they knew that they would never again take for granted the simple joy of living, of breathing, of loving. Because they had been given the greatest gift of all, and they would carry it with them always, forever.